Today we're going to continue on with our class Preaching and Teaching the Old Testament by focusing on micro-hermeneutics. We considered how in micro-hermeneutics we're considering the content, and to do that we look at the literary characteristics. Now we're going to look at the exegesis. And we're focusing on 1 Samuel chapter 1, but I thought we'd put it into show where it fits into the larger narratives of 1 and 2 Samuel. There are three larger narratives. You have Samuel narrative, Saul narrative, and David narrative. The Samuel narrative is chapters 1 to 7, Saul 8 to 15, David 1 Samuel 16 to the end of 2 Samuel 24. But in those you have smaller narratives, such as Samuel and Eli narrative, chapters 1 to 3, and you can see like the rise of Saul, chapter 8 to 11. This is when he was small in his own eyes. The rise of David, when he was depending on the Lord. You have this juxtaposition, this putting side by side the protagonist and the antagonist. So in the smaller narrative of Samuel and Eli, Samuel is blessed, Eli's sons are cursed. You see that protagonist, antagonist side by side. In the rise of Saul narratives, you have the Ammonites who are cursed and Saul is blessed. And then in the rise of David, David is blessed, Saul is cursed. But then when you're studying these narratives, sometimes you'll come across the reversal of fortune. Like in the arc narratives of chapter 4 to 7. Again, you have a juxtaposition of protagonists and antagonists. The Philistines are cursed. They started out being blessed because they stole the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God. But their fortune is reversed and the Israelites are blessed. You had the rise of Saul when he was humble in his own eyes, small in his own thinking. Then you have the decline of Saul, where he begins to disobey God. He is cursed, Jonathan is blessed. Then you have the rise of David all the way to 2 Samuel 11 and 12. This is where he sinned with Bathsheba. He is cursed. We're looking at this smaller narrative. We're actually looking at one narrative in the smaller narrative. But just to show you, the theme of 1 and 2 Samuel is God sovereignly raises up leaders. God sovereignly raised up Samuel to be the kingmaker, as he has been called, who anointed Saul and David, the first two leaders, the first two kings of Israel. You can see how God is sovereignly raising up these leaders. Let's look at the three characteristics of a plot, beginning, middle, end. And each one of these has a certain characteristics. We're in 1 Samuel 1. In the beginning of many narratives, you have the character introduced and the conflict. That's true in our story. Hannah, Elkanah, Peninnah are introduced in chapters 1 to 8, and the conflict. And in the middle of the plot, you have the solution to the problem. And if it's a simple plot, it's over. But this is not a simple plot. This is a complex plot. So we're going to see a new problem that has to be resolved. And then you have the scenes. And this is where we get into our exegetical work. This is where we begin to use those clues of when a sin when a scene begins and when it ends. Look in verse 1. You have again that common pattern. There was a certain man who lived in Ramah, Thaman, Zophim, and his name is Elkanah. He has possessions, 2 wives. And then at the end of verse 2, the conflict is mentioned, but Hannah had no children. This scene begins, we are introduced to the characters and we are introduced to the conflict. But the conflict is elaborated on in verses 3 to 8. This, when you read the notes, you'll notice this is all static. It is all, there's no action here. You have state of being verbs, but the action begins in verse 3. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship. There's your scene change or location change. Now you have action, and you're going to have conflict. He goes up once a year. He takes Hannah. He takes Peninnah with him. And then you have the first conflict when Hannah is attacked by Peninnah. Verse 5 talks about how Elkanah loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. Therefore, he compromised biblical principles, and he married Peninnah. He committed bigamy. But so now you have repetitive action. You have the repetitive action of Elkanah going to the place of worship. That says something about his character. And then you have the repetitive action of Hannah's antagonist, verse 6, and her adversary. Hannah's adversary also provoked her sore to make her fret because the Lord had shut up her womb. That was probably Peninnah's take. This is divine chastisement, because Deuteronomy promised, if you obey me, I'll make you fruitful. But she was misjudging. And again, you have repetitive action, verse 7, and as he did so year by year, she went up to the house of the Lord. And how did Hannah respond? Repeatedly. How did she respond? She did not retaliate. It says at the end of verse 7 that she wept and did not eat. The repetitive action shows the character of these people. We are introduced to the character, we're introduced to the conflict in scene 1. That conflict is laid out in scene 2, where Hannah is attacked by Peninnah, and she does not retaliate. And then she's attacked by her own husband in verse 8. Then said Elkanah, her husband, unto her, Hannah, by first dialogue. Here's the important dialogue. And he begins his first 3 statements with this same word. Why are you weeping? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? And the idea there, it's not just grieved, but bitter. And then what some call the punchline. It does not begin with why, but am I not better to you than 10 sons? She has no sons. She is barren. And he's sort of blaming her for his problem. He's got this great heritage, this big family tree in verse 1, but she cannot give him children. We're introduced to the characters. We're introduced to the conflict in the beginning scenes. Then we enter into the middle of the plot. What happens in the middle of the plot? The solution to the problem. And what does Hannah do? So Hannah rose up, location change. Elkanah's dialogue is over, content change. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. And again, you have this contrast with Hannah, who is taking the initiative, and Eli, who is passive. He is nearly blind. He is overweight. All of that says something about him. And what does she do? And she was in bitter. Even though she's in bitterness, her circumstances worse, not better. Some people believe, and it's logically possible, that the two wives, the co-wives, Hannah lived in one house, Peninnah lived in another house. But when they came together at Shiloh, that's when Peninnah attacked her. Very likely, Elkanah kept them separate. We don't know that for certain. But when she gets to Shiloh and Peninnah attacks her, she weeps. She is in bitterness. And yet she prays. She doesn't run from her problem. She doesn't make excuses. But she prays. And so you have this double vow in verse 11, where she vows that if God gives her a son, she believes that he will be a Levite. He'll serve in the temple all the days of his life. That's based on Numbers 8. But in Numbers 8, the Levites served from age 25 to 50. What did Hannah say? All the days of his life. And he will be a Nazirite based on Numbers 6. No razor upon his head. He's not just going to serve in the temple. He's going to be separated unto God. Just like Samson did not have his hair cut because it symbolized his strength. He didn't just avoid. The Nazirite vow wasn't just avoiding touching a dead animal or drinking, but positively it meant spiritual strength. And then you have the middle scene, not only the middle scene of the middle plot, but the middle scene of the entire narrative. Notice this, verse 12. This is where it starts. And it came to pass. You remember that? It's like that grammatical clue. It's like therefore, wherefore in the epistles. And it came to pass as she continued praying. So what did she do? She prayed and she continued to pray. And then God's going to answer her prayer. So she prays. She has this dialogue with with Eli. When you read the notes, the details will be fulfilled, will be filled in here. Verse 10 says she prayed, but in this scene it tells us how she prayed. She continued to pray. Verse 13, she prayed from her heart. This wasn't vain repetition. She prayed silently. She wasn't like the Pharisees on the street corners. And she poured out her heart. This is sincere praying, not for the praise of man, but because her heart is so burdened. And then the next scene, which is the end of this narrative, scene 5, if you look in verse 19, and they rose up. There's your location changed. Hannah rose up, you remember, in verse 9, but apparently her initiative has rubbed off on her husband, Elkanah, and they rose up in the morning, time change, and they worshiped before the Lord. They returned home. They had the one-flesh relationship. God answers her prayer. Back in verse 11, in that prayer, she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your handmaid and remember me. That's going to be repeated in verse 19 at the end of the verse. And Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Remember means to respond. Ecclesiastes 11:1, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Respond to God now in the days of your youth. God responded. But then you have scene 6, verse 21. And the man Elkanah and all his house went up, location change, to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. Apparently he agreed with the vow of Hannah. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. This is that turn of events. This is that second conflict, because it appears that Hannah is not going to fulfill her vow. She said all the days of his life. And Elkanah, some people believe he is expressing that in verse 23. And Elkanah, her husband, said unto her, quote, do what seems good in your eyes. Now you have to look at the Hebrew there, in your eyes. This is in your notes. But that's the same, it's very similar to the two comments in Judges 17:6, Judges 21:26, where it says, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Some people think that Elkanah is comparing Israel, comparing Hannah to Israel when Israel was in moral and religious apostasy, and they did that which was right in their own eyes. That's a possibility. So we are introduced to a second conflict. That brings us to scene 7, verse 24. And when she had weaned him. Now, the weaning in this period, and I give you the reference from First Maccabees, one of those apocryphal books. There's false teaching in the apocryphal books, but in Maccabees, there's some good history that is reliable. And in that book, it says that mothers weaned their children 3 years. They nursed and then weaned them after 3 years. She has had Samuel to spiritually prepare him for the rest of his life to serve the Lord. She is not postponing that. She is preparing him for that. And look at the end of verse 24. And the child was young. It's not a baby. This is child. This is a 3-year-old child. And what does she do? They take 3 bulls. That was the most expensive offering that was allowed by the law. They are going up to worship. They sacrifice those 3 bulls. And then she has her dialogue in verse 26. Oh, my Lord, referring to Eli. As your soul lives, so my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by you here praying unto the Lord. Hannah was a woman of prayer. What did Samuel become? Samuel became a man of prayer. In one of these verses, I'm looking at chapter 7, verse 5, and Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord. Samuel was a man of prayer. Another place says that Samuel said, God forbid that I cease to pray for you. Where did he learn to pray? In those formative years when he was at his mother's knee, Hannah was such a woman of prayer, she instilled that into Samuel. And she's still talking about prayer. In verse 27, for this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition that I ask of him. Therefore also I will give him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be given to the Lord. End of the dialogue. Notice how this narrative ends. And he worshiped the Lord there. The antecedent to he is Samuel. Can you imagine this? Hannah takes Samuel. Elkanah takes Samuel, their son. They leave him at the tabernacle. Does he pitch a fit to go back with his parents? No, he worships God because she has prepared him for service. Now, what we do a summary statement of these. Each one of these scenes, a summary statement. This is what the scene meant to the original audience. Hannah is barren. Scene 2, Hannah does not retaliate. Scene 3, Hannah prays a selfless prayer. She's not praying for a son that she might be fulfilled in some way. She is praying for a son that she might give him to the Lord, perhaps remedy the lack of spiritual leadership in Israel, which is Eli and his very wicked sons. Next scene, she continues to pray. God answers Hannah's prayer. Will Hannah give Samuel to God? Hannah worships God by giving not only 3 bulls, which was an expensive sacrifice, but her son, which was the ultimate sacrifice. Once we have these summary statements, once the scenes have been identified, then we find a timeless principle for our audience. And these can become the main divisions of our sermon. Are we barren of godly leadership? And this is the book that talks about God sovereignly raising up leaders of Israel: Samuel, Saul, David. But it opens up with barrenness. The barrenness of the mother who produced the first godly leader. What is the solution? Well, it's not retaliation. The solution is unselfish prayer. The solution is continued prayer, which God answers. Now, are we going to give our best to God when He answers our prayers? Give your best to God in worship. So this is the exegetical study. The notes give you much more detail, but I wanted us to look at that and see the importance of it. You have a lot of dialogue in these narratives, and there is such a thing as dialogical preaching. Is in contrast to monological preaching, where the preacher is the only one speaking. Look with me real quick, Acts 17. Paul practiced this. This is Acts 17 when he is at Thessalonica, verse 2. He's in the synagogue, and Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them. From that Greek word, we get our word dialogue. And you can look at these other references where when he was in the synagogue, he dialogued. It could have been question and answers, but he was not the only one speaking. Dialogical preaching from the pulpit, interview with a Bible character during the sermon, monologue by another speaker, somebody reading scripture, or maybe giving a testimony interjected into the sermon, bringing somebody else into the sermon, a mini drama, you can do that. Dialogical preaching from the congregation, scripture reading from the congregation, response from a plant in the congregation. You prearrange this. Pastor, can I ask you a question about what you just said? That'll get their attention. But it's all prearranged. So that's just a little practical application of the dialogue that we see in these narratives. I hope this has helped you with your study of narratives to learn what is the boundaries of the narrative, what is the theme, and how is that theme developed, and the development will become the main divisions in your sermon.